My name's Cassie, and I'm covering the third aspect to our presentation, exploring the physiological adaptations of polarised training when compared with high volume, low intensity, threshold, and high intensity interval training. Intensity and volume are traditionally the main variables coaches and researchers look to when trying to improve performance. The performance markers that can be manipulated and quantified across these three training types are VO2, blood lactate concentration, velocity or power output, and heart rate. These are the markers I'll be discussing across our three sports. The first study compared high volume, low intensity, polarised, threshold, and HIIT training in cyclists and cross-country skiers over 9 weeks. The pre and post tests included the determination of body mass, an incremental test protocol, work economy, and VO2 peak ramp protocol. Training intensity was heart rate controlled. Each training intervention incorporated 3 blocks lasting 3 weeks, followed by 1 week of recovery. At the end of the 9 weeks, there were no significant changes in body mass between the 3 groups. There were also no changes in heart rate and lactate peak across the groups. The change in VO2 peak and absolute VO2 peak in polarised was higher when compared with threshold and high volume training. Work economy increased in the HIIT and threshold groups only. However, work economy when expressed as peak VO2 only increased significantly through polarised training. Along with high intensity training, it also elicited the greatest adaptations at velocity or power at 4 millimoles. The results of this study show that polarised training elicits the greatest increase in VO2 peak, time to exhaustion, peak velocity or power, and along with HIIT, velocity or power at 4 millimoles. Another study compared polarised training to threshold training in 12 trained male cyclists, measuring their physiological adaptations after a 40k time trial. It was a randomised crossover within subject study where the training protocols were carried out over 6 weeks, separated by 4 weeks of detraining. Their endurance performance, incremental exercise, peak power output, and high intensity capacity were tested before and after the interventions. The physiological markers researchers measured were urine to test metabolites and a resting skeletal muscle biopsy from the vastus lateralis to assess markers of mitochondrial oxidative capacity and lactate transport. An incremental cycle test was performed to determine participants' lactate thresholds and peak power output. At the end of the study, all markers had improved after both interventions. However, peak power output, lactate threshold, and high-intensity capacity improved more after the polarised training. Moderate improvements were reported for polarised training in peak power output and also lactate threshold, which increased by 9% versus 2% for threshold training. The effect sizes for these markers in the threshold group were considered trivial or small. Mean power output increased for both interventions. However, absolute and percentage change increase was greater in polarised at 8% versus 4% in threshold training, but this wasn't significant. Meanwhile, there was a moderate increase in time to complete the 40k time trial in polarised training by 2.3 minutes compared with 0.4 of a minute for threshold training. High intensity capacity and peak power output also significantly increased in the polarised group by 85% versus 37% for threshold. The results of this study show that 6 weeks of polarised training resulted in greater physiological markers of performance such as lactate threshold, peak power output, high intensity, and time to complete the time trial. The final study I'll discuss was carried out on competitive runners, cyclists, and cross-country skiers who were randomly assigned 9 weeks of either polarised, HIIT, or a control group who continued their usual high-volume, low-intensity training. This control incorporated no more than 2 threshold training sessions per week. Pre- and post-training testing were a maximal anaerobic running or cycling test and a VO2 max ramp protocol, which determined their VO2 max and heart rate max. Adaptations the researchers measured were anaerobic power, heart rate recovery, and peak power or velocity at absolute lactate concentrations. Results showed that HIIT significantly increased peak power or velocity by 6.4%, while there were no changes in the polarised or control groups. Heart rate recovery was faster in both HIIT and polarised, with HIIT showing the greatest percentage change at 11.2% versus 7.9% for polarised and 0.9% for the control. No training protocol improved velocity or power at the established lactate concentrations of 4, 6, and 10 millimoles, which the authors said was unexpected. Overall, this study concluded that only high-intensity interval training can significantly improve peak velocity or power, and only training regimens that utilize HIIT, including polarized training, can have a positive impact on heart rate recovery. None of the discussed interventions improved velocity or power at established lactate concentrations, while there were no improvements to neuromuscular, anaerobic, or heart rate parameters in the high-volume control group. In summary, polarized training appears to have a greater effect on physiological markers of endurance performance, such as lactate threshold, peak power output, time to complete, time to exhaustion, and VO2 peak in competitive endurance athletes. However, programs that include more high-intensity interval training may elicit greater adaptations in peak velocity or power and heart rate recovery. Results that differed between these studies regarded velocity or power at established lactate concentrations. Stogel and Sperlich reported that polarized and HIIT training improved velocity or power at 4 millimoles, while Stogel and Bjorklund report no intervention elicited improvements. However, some established concentrations differed between these studies, which may affect the outcomes. Thank you.